Hello and welcome to this first episode of a tutorial series about extending Pano2VR with JavaScript. My name is Thomas Breitenfeld and I'm a panoramic photographer and a web developer as well. And after 25 years of experience in both fields, I love it to create complex Pano2VR projects matching my own ideas or the needs of my clients. With Pano2VR's JavaScript API, you can extend standard projects like this one I've prepared for you here for this tutorial, with a lot of new features which are going far beyond the capabilities Pano2VR has in its app, in the main app, or in the skin editor. And you can massively boost the possibilities you have by using standard web technologies like JavaScript or some JavaScript frameworks to extend the feature kit you have with your work in Pano2VR. This tutorial is the first one of a larger planned series, and the goals of this introduction, the basic tutorial, is to get you familiar with the structure of the web output Pano2VR creates, to understand what files are in this web output folder and how are they working together, and where you can get a grip on the internal data Pano2VR provides to you, or where can you manipulate a Pano2VR project while it's running in the browser of the visitor. This tutorial is meant as a solid primer for everybody who is not familiar with web technologies. If you have some web dev skills, then you can easily skip this tutorial, as I don't tell you anything really new here. And for everybody else, this is a basic to get a grip on the autonomy Pano2VR projects have, and where you can intervene to do your own things with a project Pano2VR creates. Let's now have a closer look on what you can achieve with extending Pano2VR using its JavaScript API. To not talk too much, let's have a look on some real examples I have prepared for you. Let's have a look at this one. Here we have a Pano2VR project which consists of 4 nodes, and here we have some custom fonts integrated. This can be done in the skin editor. Meanwhile, the project is a little bit older. They're made with version 6, so we need some extra tricks to get external fonts running on a project. But I have transferred this project to 7, but showing the main thing you have here with this footer bar. Here we have a short description and a title on the bottom of the page. This is changing when you go to another node, and this is showing the current node here in this tab bar. And if you head over to the 4th room, you see this. And this is not only a one direction interaction, it is also in both directions. If you click here, the panel is changing, and also here. And the text here is changing as well. And one thing this example provides is this section here in the bottom of the page. This is not made in the skin editor. It's a separate part of the page, and it is made with a very popular front-end or user interface framework called Bootstrap, which brings a lot of styling features with it, and it is very simple to understand and very simple to apply, and it's working together with Pano2VR using the JavaScript API. Bootstrap is a combination between CSS and JavaScript. They are working together to achieve a lot of interactive features and layout functions and so on. And in this example, I combined a tabbed content with 4 tabs and a content box below interacting with the Pano2VR output. And we also have some links. These are not web links, but they are links moving the panorama to some points of interest within the nodes. So here in the stone hall, you can have a look at the piano. It's a very simple example. Or here in the big hall at the beginning of the tour, you can point the user's interest to the ceiling, which he may not see on the first glance, and having a look to this fantastic painting on the ceiling. This is one example with the combination of Pano2VR with a JavaScript CSS framework, which is very popular. Bootstrap is originally invented from by the Twitter guys in former years, and it is open source and an own development of its own in between. It's extremely popular, and very much websites are using this framework. We get to this in detail in a later tutorial. And the next example is a problem which is pretty frequently when I have a look at Facebook or the forums concerning Pano2VR extensions and the image gallery, which is triggered by a hotspot. It is a very popular problem. You can easily solve it by doing this in the frame here as a separate Pano2VR project, but it's a little bit overcomplicated. And if you want to have it a little bit sleeker, then you use a JavaScript generated gallery. And there you have some features where you can swipe the images, and you can create slideshows, and with very few lines of code you can create these gallery hotspots. They are triggering a JavaScript gallery which is thrown in a pop-up window in the skin editor, and it's a very nice example for interaction with external JavaScript using the JavaScript API in Pano2VR. And one last thing is a more advanced project. This is the Palace Garden in Vienna, the Schönbrunn Palace Garden. And there we have a lot of antique statues here at the both ends of this big place here in the center of the park. And you see all these statues here. There's some on the east side and some on the west side. And this tour is a little walk along these west side statues. And the special thing here is, up to here it's a pretty normal Pano2VR project, but we have some special stuff here. If you click on one of these hotspots above the statues, you get some information, some content. This content is combined with a black and white photo I did on location, additionally to the panorama images, and the text you get here. It is directly loaded from Wikipedia. And this is an external data source, and this is a very powerful feature you can add with JavaScript to Pano2VR projects. And this is a pretty advanced project in an upcoming tutorial where you learn how to use these interfaces you can have to external data sources to feed data, even images, into a Pano2VR project. In the next few sections of this tutorial, let's have a look at the output anatomy of this project I've prepared for you. I've shown it already, and this is the result you get in the web browser. And now let's go to Pano2VR to analyze how it's made of and what's configured specially. The project is pretty normal, nothing special, just for showing the output structure of Pano2VR. We have a normal HTML template using here, and I have a standard output folder, and I had a copy of the Venice skin made here. Let's have a close look at this, at the modifications I made later. And now we have here a simple floor plan as an aerial overview, and you see this is here a simple image, and the hotspots are set manually. It's not geographically exact, doesn't need to be. And here we have our 4 points and the connections between them. It's a little bit curvy as it's not a geographic exactly representation of on how the points are located. If you go into the world map, you have no geodata attached. It's just visually made here, and this map is introduced in the skin. So for this I use the Venice skin. Let's open it, and here we have the only modifications. Here is the floor plan. In the Venice skin you have a full screen content, a larger map, and you have a floor plan content. This is a smaller map, and this is a full screen map, and this is the little map in the corner. And the only thing I changed here was to disable the radar, because it doesn't make any sense as it isn't a flat map with a view from above. And then I changed the map pin a little bit, other styling and so on. It's everything I've done here. Everything is left as it was provided in this factory skin. When I'm now hitting the cogwheel button or press Command Option G to generate an output in this folder, then Pano2VR does its magic and provides a lot of files to make a working project the visitor can view it in the browser. Now let's have a look at it. And so let's change to the Finder, and having a Finder window, grabbing it to here. So here it is. And here we have our project. This is the Pano2VR project. This is a modified Venice skin. I stored it in the project directory, hence the $D sign here. Usually it's a way to go, not to alter skins in the main skin folder of the program, but save an edited copy along with your Pano2VR file to keep things tidy and together. So everything is familiar here. There's some graphic files. This is my aerial map I used for the 3D map here, and some material. And here we have the output folder, and that's what we need to discuss in detail. What all these files are doing. All these files are generated automatically by Pano2VR, and the main parts is the index HTML. This is effectively the page the user is calling in his browser. And the other files of importance are the player itself. This is the Pano2VR player. It's a JavaScript file doing all the magic. This is the center. It's the main engine doing all the stuff, and everything is connected to this file. The HTML file loads it, and then we have the skin.js file. It's a JavaScript file which builds up the skin in the browser's window of the visitor. In the tiles folder you have the images of all nodes. It is several zoom levels and several cube face sizes, and the tour XML is the structural representation of the tour, which node is where, what's the name, where's the user data, how they are connected, where are the hotspots located. This is effectively the description, the technical description of the tour. But let's discuss this later in detail. Before, I have prepared some slides about the basic structure of a Pano2VR file and how it's working. In these slides, I'm going from the origin. Here we have some panoramas. They are meant to be assembled to a virtual tour with Pano2VR. And here is the program which is imported. Here is the Pano2VR app which imports the panoramas. And serves as a control center for everything else. After this, we have an export function. So it is the output, the panos are the input, and the web output is one of the possible outputs of Pano2VR, and that's what's on our scope here. This interactive web output, this export, what this is in detail, this is the topic of this tutorial, and let's have a closer look to this. What is it made of? So if I go to my next slide, then we have this output on the right side, the export, and it is consisting first of an HTML file, normally the index HTML. Then we have the JavaScript part, usually consisting of the player itself and the skin files. These are two JavaScript files. And finally CSS. CSS normally isn't shown as a separate file as it's generated from the skin JS. JavaScript has the ability to generate code as CSS code and HTML code as well. That is one of its superpowers. And so the CSS files aren't necessary. You can use them, but you don't need to, as the JavaScript, especially the skin JS, is doing it for you. Let's have a closer look at these files. And here we see what is Pano2VR exporting. We have general files which are consisting of HTML and CSS and JS files, and we have of course JPEG files, image files. They are the image content of the panorama tour, and we have an XML file which is usually named tour XML or something else. This is only one file, and this file, as I said before, is describing the whole structure of the tour, where the panoramas are living. This is a container for user data. It is the description of all hotspots and the technical layout where the hotspots are located, inside of the image spheres, and so on. And the next files we have are media files. These can be JPEGs for, let's say, image galleries or PNGs. Also map files can be JPEGs or PNG files. Then we have a lot of buttons and interface elements. These are SVG files. This is vector graphics. They can be integrated into the JS files of the skin JS. You can configure this, but they can be separate files as well. And the next section of files is really the media files, as PDFs for download and display, MP4 files for videos, or MP3 files for audio. These are loaded by, let's say, by hotspots or by some skin functions, and these are additional and optional files you have here in this file output. This is what really is generated by Pano2VR when you hit the export button, the generate button with the cogwheel. Up to now we have a bunch of files outputted by Pano2VR, but now we want to know how these files are working together. And let's have a look at the first file. This is the HTML file. The HTML file is the container. It works like a general structural description, how the page is built in the browser and what is loaded furthermore to build up the whole tour. Let's have a car as a symbol for what these files are doing. The HTML file delivers a rough structure, and let's see it as the exterior of a car, just a mechanical basic construction where everything else is built in. Let's go further, and we have JavaScript. JavaScript adds functionality and interactivity to a HTML page. It can manipulate the page, it can react to events, it can react to mouse interactions, it can change the structure, it can show and hide stuff. And let's compare this JavaScript file with wheels and all the moving parts of a car, and literally with everything a car needs to move. The CSS file is responsible for the look of a HTML file, and it can be embedded into the HTML file and can be changed by the JavaScript file. And let's compare it with the outfit of a car, with the surface and all the aesthetic details. And these CSS files are also responsible for the layout of a page, for the exact measurements of boxes, and for the colors used, and for the fonts used. And last but not least, let's take the tour structure, the XML file. And this is kind of a wiring diagram where all the electricity inside of a car is described. And last but not least, we have the JPEG files, mainly the panoramic image content, which is visible for the visitor in the browser. After having a look to the basic purposes of the outputted files Pano2VR creates in an output folder of a tour, now let's have a look how these files are working together. First, we have the index.html. This is the initial page load we have. This is the first file which needs to be completely loaded to have everything else following. And when this index.html file is loaded completely, it's very small, so the loading process should be very fast. After that, it's loading the player.js or Pano2VR underscore player, and this is the main engine. And it is loaded by the index.html. So this is definitely always the second file being loaded. Maybe some others are loaded before, but this depends on the HTML template you are using. But the first important main file is the Pano2VR player.js. This is responsible for loading the first Pano images, or generally loading images. They are loaded not with a call you making in the browser, but it's loaded by the JavaScript in the player. So this player does this loading job for all images. After this, the skin.js is loaded, and this skin.js is kind of a blueprint for the complete user interface you have in the skin, with all your buttons, or if you have menus or cloners or maps or your control interface, everything is added by skin.js. And all hotspots you define in the skin editor, they are built by skin.js and put it in their respective places and integrated into the HTML page dynamically when the panorama is running and moving, and they are newly added when you enter a new node. All this stuff is done by the player together with skin.js. The index.html has a blueprint and a master file. This is a GGT file, usually normal.ggt, and this is a Garden Gnome template, is the extension for it. And this file is the scaffolding for the index.html, and here you have all descriptions and all structural technical data you need to build this index.html, or the Pano2VR output has this description. When the player is loaded, after that the tour XML is loaded by the player, and the tour XML is getting all the infos for the tour layout, for the linking of the panoramas, where are the hotspots defined, and the Pano images, loading directives for the player. So the tour XML says, okay, when I'm going to node 20, then please load the images for node 20. This is the player doing after reading tour XML. So it's kind of the blueprint for the whole tour. After these directives the player got from tour XML the player is loading the panorama images from the respective subfolders in the tiles folder. That's the operation sequence for the tour itself. All these informations are coming from the Pano2VR file itself. That's what you're doing in the main app of Pano2VR. The skin editor generates the skin.js when you hit the export button, the generate button, and the skin.js generates CSS code in the browser of the user. As a standard, we have no external CSS files in a Pano2VR output, as this CSS is built dynamically from skin.js in the browser of your visitor. So it's generated, and everything what's happening here is described in the ggsk file, the skin file you have. So these three files on the right side are describing how this loading and working sequence is running when the user is loading the index.html file in his browser. Why I'm telling all this? The sequence is pretty important, as you need to know when certain parts of the project are loaded and operating. If you load some stuff too early, especially when you're loading JavaScript too early and the rest of the project isn't available yet, then you get error messages. So you need to make sure that you manipulate, let's say as an example, if you like to manipulate something in the skin dynamically, then you need to be sure that skin.js has its job completely done. You shouldn't do anything earlier than this moment. So this operating sequence is pretty important to understand when you want to manipulate stuff with using the JavaScript API of Pano2VR. After having a look at Pano2VR's export and after having a look to the files interoperation and loading sequence, now let's have a closer look to the files themselves, how they are built up and what they are doing in detail. What we see here in this project's output in the browser is the index.html I mentioned before. How is this file looking like? You can have a look at tools, browser tools, and you page source or command U, and then you'll see the code Pano2VR is generating. You can look at it here. It is pretty complicated. You don't need to understand it at this point. And there's additionally some stuff here for the live preview, which is not exported for real projects when you're using them on production on your website or somewhere else. Here you see the Pano2VR player loaded, the skin.js loaded here, some mapping files which are added if you're using a map based on leaflet, some player files you load from Vimeo or YouTube, depending on you have a YouTube or Vimeo player in your skin. What's the case in the Venice skin? There is a standard YouTube and Vimeo player built in, and if they built in, they load the libraries from YouTube or from Vimeo, no matter you using them or not. This is only a view of the so-called source code. You can have it a little bit more structured and better to understand if you use the browser developer tools. You can use the shortcut Alt-Command-I or Alt-Command-C, because these shortcuts are different from browser to browser. What's working in most browsers is just hitting the F12 key, and so you can have the so-called web developer tools. Let's have a first view on it. I will tell about this later a little bit more. And here we see some basic messages when the file is loaded, the version of the Pano2VR player, and this is for the live view. This is not happening on production side, but only during development. And in this console, it is your main instrument to talk to this project. Here you can make inputs and here you get outputs if you want. And this console, the browser console, is a very important instrument to work with the JavaScript API of Pano2VR. The inspector shows the details of the code, but it's highly interactive. It's combined with CSS, so you can have a look to elements here and to inspect elements. So let's say you want to look how is this thumbnail menu built, right mouse click and look at inspect, and you are pointed to this element. You can unfold it and then you see the scroll area. You will recognize and remember some stuff you had inputted in the skin editor, or gg skin underscore svg is usually image file. Here's the closing cross. Here you see the file data and the positions. Here you see the so-called inline CSS. These everything what's mentioned here in the style tag. This is the CSS. The skin.js is adding to position elements to control the look and feel of all these internet interface elements. And everything is embedded into this HTML structure. And if you compare this file with the command U, with the HTML code which is effectively loaded by your browser, then you will see you have this tag called div. This is a container. It's called container. It is 100% wide and width and height of the browser fenster, and this container is originally empty. There's only put a short sentence loading, and this is the area where everything is happening. And skin.js does nothing else than to replace this content with the whole tour. And if you now unfold the container, something completely different is in there. And here you see everything the player is doing, the viewer, the hotspots, and so on. And the hotspot text. These are elements generated by skin.js, and most of them, especially the hotspots, are regenerated in the moment I'm changing the node. Everything inside of this section is completely newly generated. So this is the HTML page with all the stuff which is generated by skin.js and by the panorama player inside of this HTML basic structure. After having a closer look to the HTML file and the HTML structure, let's now have a look at the two JavaScript files which are important for the tour working. And we have a skin.js and the Pano2VR player.js. Let's have a look at these files. We can do it easily with command U, and then we have some links we just need to click, hit the command button to open it in the new tab. This is a Pano2VR JavaScript player. As this is a main engine, it is protected and encrypted. You cannot read something meaningful from it. It is compacted and encrypted, and here my license is in the command on the top of the page, and everything else you cannot understand. It's just working. The next one is the skin.js. It is much more interesting for us as it builds up the complete skin and interface and user interface elements and hotspots. So here you see, just quick scroll through it. Here you see all the variables defined you have in the general page of the skin editor and some basic objects defined, and then everything here is built up step by step. The word me is the skin itself, and here you see some elements built up, and if you read along here you see some CSS files built up. You see some element names you will remember from your skin editor elements. They usually start with an underscore, and here control the right is a skin element, and then everything is attached here. Styles and events as well. It's a pretty complicated file, and it is, as I said before, it is kind of a blueprint to build up the skin in the user's browser. It's not delivered readily from the server, but it's built up on runtime in the user's browser. And as the skin is JavaScript generated, you have an object you can see and manipulate, and you can ask questions to get some data from it, and these objects are accessible in the console tab of your web developer tools. If you type Pano and you see Pano2VR, Pano player, and you see Pano is an object, if you add a dot, then you can see some stuff you maybe have read about in the documentation of the JavaScript API of Pano2VR. So here you can see values and events and everything. You basically anything you can do in the Pano2VR main app can be done here with JavaScript. And a similar object like Pano is the object skin. And if you enter after skin a dot starting with an underscore, you can see the elements and can ask some properties and so on. And you can define, can see, okay, how far is it away from the top of the page, or client top, it is 0 pixels, and so on. And we get into deeper details in a later tutorial where we analyze these objects and what you really can do with them. Another file exported by Pano2VR I mentioned before is the tour.xml file, and this file isn't directly accessible from the HTML page because it is not loaded here. You see it here, and it is a process. In this line, let's talk about it shortly. The read config all async, it is a process of the player which calls this tour.xml file and reads its content. So he gets the mentioned directive to load images and nodes and so on. It is a so-called method. It's a process attached to this panorama player object. And we can use it and we can disable it and manipulate this tour.xml file externally. That's a pretty nice entry point for large projects where the tour.xml isn't generated anymore from Pano2VR, but let's say from an external database. You can just copy it and add it here in the browser, and you can just have a look at it in the browser. And an XML file is consisting of tags. You can define the structure completely by your own purposes. And here you see the panorama ID, and the input is dealing with images. And here you see the zoom levels. And here's the preview image, and the input is finished. And now it starts the view parameters, where it's north, and so on. What's the default view? And here we have the user data with all stuff in it, and the map coordinates you have on the floor plan. And here you have the hotspot sections, not very much. It's only one hotspot here. Transitions and so on and so on. Here starts the next panorama and so on. And after the panoramas finished, you have here the hotspots for the maps and a master node and so on. And all structural data is described here. This file isn't that important if you use the JavaScript API, but sometimes it can be helpful, and you can do a lot of manipulations if you read the tour.xml file by your own processes in your own JavaScript, and then make the panorama player load this XML, which is processed by you and your processes you designed for manipulating stuff. The main purpose of this process is, especially if you want to translate the tour and you don't want to use the process for translation Pano2VR provides. And so it was usual to translate Pano2VR 6 projects due to its lack of the translation function to do this by manipulating the true XML file, translating all text content, and then let the Pano2VR player read in this manipulated XML code. You can do a lot of stuff with it, but it's pretty complicated, and partly it's not necessary anymore as Pano2VR 7 has this built-in translation function. Last but not least in this section, let's have a look at CSS and the CSS inline styles generated by Pano2VR in the skin editor and its output. Let's have a look at this element here. It's a header and we can inspect it, and let's have a look how it's built up. So we have here this upper container and we have a rectangle. It is obviously the background, as it is an RGBA value, which is 3 color values and 1 alpha value for the opacity. You can see it is semi-transparent here. And the container itself has 60 pixels height. And you can now find this element and compare what's here inserted from the skin.js as a ready CSS code. And let's now go to Pano2VR and to the skin editor and head over to the header here. And we have here this element, and it is 60 pixels high, and here we have the header background, and you see these values 100%, 0, 0, but here it's really easy to recognize. Here 60 pixels, 100% width, and you see it exactly here, 60 pixels and 100% width. And what's nice with this function, you not only can read this, but you can manipulate it in the browser directly. If you use the cursor keys, now you can say, okay, how it's looking when it's 60, 70 pixels wide. You can really test it in real time, and if it's fine, you can add it in the skin editor, and you can, okay, let's take 70 pixels here. Save, and then it's updated in the live view, and now we have 70 pixels here. If you re-inspect it, then you see here in the container we have now these 70 pixels. So you can identify skin elements and their styles in these web development tools in the browser and set them in relation to everything you did enter in the skin editor. The skin editor can be seen in 2 parts. This is building up the object you can address in the console with skin, point, and so on. And everything what you're seeing here is inserted as inline CSS to the elements in the HTML structure you see here. So this is basically the 2 jobs the tree view and the properties box are doing when you look at the results of the code Pano2VR exported for the web display. In this section of our tutorial, let's have a first closer look on Pano2VR's JavaScript API. Before I continue, let's explain what an API is and what it does. API is an acronym but stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's a mechanism to make an object of any software available for communication from and to itself. So we have 2 objects here in Pano2VR. The first object is a panorama player, mostly as an object named Pano, and the second object is skin, and it's also named skin. And these objects can communicate from inside out and from the exterior to the interior, also in both directions. In other words, objects have properties and objects have methods. Methods are procedures, functions, so the object can do anything or you can do something with the object. And the properties is how the object looks like, acts like, and so on. And the third thing to mention when it comes to an object is they can have children, kind of sub-objects. These sub-objects are usually notated with a dot after the name, so Pano dot, and then we have either sub-objects or either methods or either properties. We will have a closer look on this a little bit later. And this JavaScript API of Pano2VR is documented for us with a human readable documentation. On the other hand, if we switch to the browser console, when we have the browser here in this window and I hit the F12 key, then we have the console opening, and if I type Pano, then you see there are coming some suggestions. The Pano2VR player and the Pano object. And here we get a preliminary result. It changes as we type, and the object usually starts with its sub-objects or anything else with curly braces, and everything else is inside of it. And if I type the next character as a dot, then I get a suggestion list what is available. There are some cryptic vocabularies here and some elements and items with a $sign in front of it, and then there is some stuff coming which sounds familiar. Add hotspot. This is a method to add a hotspot to a panorama. Or let's scroll a little bit down. There's a lot of cryptic stuff, it's not so interesting for us, but here, change field of view. It's a function, a method to tell the Pano object to change the field of view. And we have also the skin object. And the skin object, if we type a dot afterwards, we get our elements, with usually starting with an underscore. And these objects and the methods they have are available in the console, and we can type stuff here to tell something to the panorama, but we also can get information from the panorama. And we will check this in detail in the next few sections of this part of the tutorial. And this API is not only documented with human readable documentation we have here in the Pano2VR JavaScript API. I'll come back to this page later because it's very important. And also an object, if it's set up this way, and Pano2VR is set up this way, it reveals itself, its properties, its methods, and its children elements in the console. Just by typing, okay, the skin object, it is known to the browser, and the browser can dig deeper into it. And it's a very nice method to discover or to explore an object, is first to type it in the console and then dig down by using dots or choosing elements from the suggestion list. Now let's set up a first very simple example, and I go to the Pano2VR skin editor, and let's have a look at the tree. Nothing is selected, that's what I want, and let's have the general variable list we have here, and let's choose the variable with floor plan or with map, one of them, and let's memorize it and then go to the browser, and let's check how we can get this variable from inside of the Pano2VR player object. Let's start typing Pano dot, and we now get a suggestion list. And if you want something to know from an object, most programmers, it's not mandatory, but most programmers do it as a good style. If you want to know something of an object, usually the function begins with get, and if you want to manipulate something, it is starting with set. We will see that it's also here the case with Pano2VR's JavaScript API. And let's type get, and let's continue with a V. And now we have get variable value. And you see, when it is chosen here in the list and I click on it, so it turns green, so this variable value function is ready for us to use. As I want to do something with the Pano object, it is a function, it's a method, and though it suggests here it is a function, and a function most of the time it needs an argument, so we have to type normal braces. And now let's type the name of the variable I want to know with map. It is false. Let's change to the skin editor and let's have a look what we can else check with thumbnails, for example. As we have the thumbnails menu open, let's type it. Thumbnails, and it is true. So this variable says us the thumbnail menu is open. If I close it and just delete the last character and then re-enter it so that it's we get a refresh of this variable, then it's false. So there is a way to get some information from the panorama, from inside to the outside. So this is the one way. We can get information from within the panorama object or from within the player to outside. So I can get a grip on all variables I have in the panorama player available. Also, we have some general properties like get field of view, for example. You won't get a value here, but if you type the curvy braces here, then you have the value 70 degrees. And if I zoom in a bit and delete the last brace, then we get a new value. The other way around, if you want to tell the panorama something from outside or send commands into it, then we try to use the opposite. So let's have the Pano object dot, and let's have a variable function which allows us to set a value inside of the panorama from outside, from the console. If you are looking for some function or something, you need to do something with the panorama object, with the Pano object, then you can use the JavaScript API. It is in the documentation under reference at the end, and the JavaScript API you will find it's only one page, so you can have full text search on this page. I'll just type Command F and let's have variable, and okay, some typos, not that fine. And here you get some skin variables, get variables, that was the stuff we did in the section before, and set variable. Here you get a documentation, how it's written, what a function expects. Here it expects a string. A string is just a sequence of characters in opposite to numbers, which are only numbers, and you can calculate with. And the third type of variable we are using here are booleans. It's a variable which can be only true or false. You see, if you want to get a variable, you only need the name of this variable as a string. If you want to set a variable, you see, if you have the function set variable value, you need first you need the name of the value you want to set, and then the value you want this variable to be set to. And let's try it now in the console. And let's just get this variable we have here. So set variable. Please keep in mind these variables and these functions or everything you type in JavaScript is case sensitive. So set variable need to be written exactly like that. So set variable value, and you first need, let's take the variable from above with thumbnails, and now you need a comma and you need the value, as with thumbnails is a Boolean variable. Let's have a look here, true, false. This is one of these three types: numbers, text a string, numbers, and you have here true, false. It's a Boolean variable, and now it expects true. Please mind it is typed without apostrophes. So if I now hit enter, it sets this variable to true, and you see the thumbnail box pops up. It makes it visible. So you have an external control of elements inside of the panorama player or inside of the skin. These variables here are attached to the skin, but you can set them and read them by the Pano object. They have some methods and some constructions in common. It's a convention inside of Pano2VR that the variables are attached to the Pano object while they are in fact skin variables, but as they interact with the Pano player, and the Pano player is the highest director in this theater here, it is running with the Pano object. And we have now a two-way communication into the panorama and from the panorama, and you can set values and you can read values to get information what's happening inside of the panorama, or you can control it from outside. And this controlling from outside is a very, very powerful feature. Well, it's nice to have the console and the direct access to the JavaScript API of Pano2VR available in the browser. Let's now move to a little bit more practical example with having a skin element talk to the console or to throw an alert. So something which is not done by typing in the console, but it's working from inside the Pano2VR object. And let's now turn to the skin editor, and I want to have a little button in the upper left corner. Let's just take a little text box and let's make it center and some radius so it looks a little bit nice, hand cursor and so on. And instead of text we type test and just have a look what's doing it here. I save it and the live review should give us this button. It's doing nothing. So let's add an action to it and move down to the actions section of the properties and double click to get a new action. If you want to do something with JavaScript, there's an kind of a trick, but it's a silent convention. It's also described in the Pano2VR documentation. On top, you see that if you want to use JavaScript in a skin editor, start with JavaScript colon in the text field or in some actions, and these actions need to be of the go-to URL type. So let's head over here and type go-to URL and type JavaScript colon. And now let's have an alert box popping up inside of the screen. So this function is in JavaScript alert. And now we need single quote and let's say hello and close with a semicolon. If you want to have longer script lines, you can use this large editor field. It's escape to another screen here, and you can even write complex long functions here. You don't need the target, it's not necessary here. And now if you hit OK and save it, turn to the tool itself, and if you hit the button you get an alert. This is a standard box popped up by the browser. Usually on top you see what's the origin. The origin is the server we are now using, localhost, and the respective port number, and this is the text we wanted to output in this alert, and so on. This is one way you can to let a skin element communicate with the browser. And now let's change it a little bit, because the alert is a little bit annoying, because you always need to quit it with the OK button. And now let's use the much more convenient way to route an output to the console. Back to the skin editor. Don't need to change very much. Instead of alert, you can access the console object. This is a standard object of the browser, it's part of it, and it has a function which names log. So the console logs some text you enter in the braces here afterwards. And let's hit OK, save, and now let's have a look what's happening now. And if you click here on this button, now the console is throwing a line hello, and it is originated by skin.js, as it is a skin function. We add it manually by typing this action. This is a standard way to communicate from skin to the console to get some stuff done outside of Pano2VR in the browser console. To complete our first basic look on Pano2VR's JavaScript API, let's have a little sidestep back again to CSS, which can be very helpful when you are using JavaScript, as it is not only responsible for styling and fonts and so on, but it can also be used to identify and to mark objects which you want to be treated with the JavaScript API. Let's have a look on this. We already have learned that we can inspect elements with right mouse button and get to the inspector, and we have a rectangle here, and we can manipulate it. If you want to change this font size, go to inspect and add some font size here. Just go to the last element and type a new one if it's not available, but here it is available, so you can tweak it by putting the cursor in here and nudging it with the arrow keys on your keyboard, or just type in the value you want to have it. When we have a closer look at the HTML code, which is generated by skin.js, then you see a lot of classes added to the divs, which are making up the whole interface and which are built by skin.js, and what we see now as the user interface on top of the panorama. We have a 3D space here, and we have a 2D space here with all these elements like the title or the current node. And you see some classes. These are generic classes, and it is pretty difficult to find a certain element here in this HTML code tree. And you see some generic elements like ggSkin. This is a general class, and nearly everything has. And you have a ggSkin rectangle, and this is the container here. And you have some rectangles, some containers, and so on. And you have some code elements and some text elements. The text elements, for example, you have a div, and inside of the text element there is another div, and this is the inner box, and you can sometimes identify them by the text they are containing, but there's a nice trick to change the classes or to change the CSS by another way. If you go to the skin editor, you have the possibility to enter your own CSS in the general properties. Let's close up this here, and in the lower section you have the possibility to add external files to the skin. These can be CSS files, so you can extend what Pano2VR generates in the skin editor. You can do it also a little bit on the upper side with embedded style sheet. Here you see some CSS code, and if you hit this box you see some specific CSS code you have here in the skin editor, which changes some properties and stylings which are not defined in the elements themselves. If you click on any element here, you can change a lot of parameters, and everything what you see here is translated into CSS, more or less, the most stuff. Some is JavaScript, like the actions and modifiers, but the most parameters you can change here are building the inline CSS of the skin editor. And if you go to the general properties, just by clicking outside of the stage, then you have this part here, and you can add your own CSS here, extending what's built up in the skin. To get a grip on a specific element you want to change, you can use CSS classes. And how this is done and what's the benefit for using the JavaScript API, I will discuss in the next section. If you want to use your own CSS in Pano2VR, it's pretty simple. Let's introduce some custom CSS. For an element I select in the skin, let's have a look. Maybe we just choose this title, the node title in the upper right corner here, and let's find it here. There I have the header. This is some custom stuff I introduced into this project, and let's have it here. So, and we have here the user title outputted in a text field, and its color is white. Let's keep it this way to recognize some differences if I change something. And under advanced you can add your own CSS styles for this element here and for the inner element. And as we have seen in the section before, we have two elements usually when we have text. Let's switch to the browser. We have a text container, the outside, and this is the box itself, what you see here, and the text field inside of it is a separate element which is living inside here. It has no classes, just inline styles, and usually the outer element is for positioning, as you see it here, position absolute right, top, and so on. And you can see all the geometric parameters of this box itself, and inside you will find font size, font weight, text align, white space, and so on, more text related parameters. This makes sense for a lot of use cases. It makes it complicated on the first glance, as you need to think about text elements as always two elements which are nested into each other. And so let's inspect this, and now let's introduce a class here. A class is a name. It mustn't start with a number. It always needs letters and dashes and underscores, nothing else, no spaces, no diacritic signs like German umlauts or anything else. So let's just choose a name. It's up to you how it's named. Pano title. It should be descriptive to make it findable. And if I save it here and go back to the output and just right click and inspect it here, you will see we have this box here, the outer box. ggskin is a general class living everywhere. ggskin underscore text is a generic description of a text box. And here we have a class. Inside there we have the generic CSS inline styles describing the textual output. And so we have a class here, and now we can use it to identify just this text box, and we can use it, for example, to just copy it. And now let's go to the, just deselect it to get into the general properties, and let's add a class. Just scroll down, make this box a little bit bigger, and let's have dot and paste it. If you want to address a class, it always has a dot in front of it. Now we use curly braces and just change something. Color, it is a text color, colon. You can type in some color values or simply yellow as a name of a color. We have named colors in CSS and numbered colors and so on in different numbering schemes, and for the values and so on. And now let's insert it a bit and close it with a curly brace. Okay, save. And now let's have a look what's happening. You see nothing. That has a reason. Let's have a look and let's dig down here in the inspector, and we have an element, and we have an inline style here, and we have a class. And now we have some strange stuff. We have Pano title. This is our class we have defined, and we have color yellow, but it's striked through. Why is it? Because if you have an inline style and here the color is white, then you cannot define it with a class. Inline style always has the last word. It overrules everything. If we want to overrule an inline style with a class, with a definition from outside, you need to add a little extra, and this is named exclamation mark, and you see it is the only parameter with an exclamation mark, important. And this means exclamation mark important means I want to overrule everything what's told, even in inline styles, and now it is yellow. So just copy it, copy, go back to the editor and insert it here, copy, okay, I need to insert it at the end, not the whole line. And now color yellow important. And now it overrules everything what's told to this element before. Save. And now it should be yellow out of the box. And this is the first and most simple way to use classes to address specific elements and their look inside of Pano2VR, so it has an extension box really built in to make your own edits. You see here something like filter drop shadows, because shadows cannot be introduced in the properties of a text box. You need to do it manually with CSS, and there we have the filter drop shadow edit. This is a CSS parameter with color value and shadow distances, and even an RGB value, an RGBA value. So we have 3 color values and an opacity value and so on. And you can use all CSS properties which are available in CSS itself, not only the ones you have offered here. It is only a small section of what CSS can do. which is available here with all these numbered entries. CSS can do a lot more, but there need to be some restrictions to get the user interface not too crowded and too overcomplicated. And this is a way to add classes to elements in the skin editor and to use them to do some styling tweakings. With using CSS classes inside of Pano2VR skin, you are able to implement another very helpful feature. It is just to identify objects inside of the Pano2VR skin. As we have, when we have a look here, we have most of the time we have only generic classes like ggskin or the ggskin text, and the elements are, especially in very complicated skins, we have not really a chance to address a single element, to manipulate it or something like that. And here we can use classes to quickly find elements. Just remember, we have added in the last section, we added the class Pano_title to this little text field in the upper right corner. And now let's just quickly find it. If you don't know where it is, or maybe it is off screen, or it is switched off, or you don't know where it is, and then you can use the search box of the inspector. All browser developer tools have this. Sometimes the search bar is on the bottom. Usually it is invoked by Command F if the developer tools have the focus. In Firefox it is always open on top, and if you type Pano, you already see it as a suggestion title. It just goes to there when you hit enter. It should be. Here it finds it in the CSS code, which is implemented here. But if you type a dot in front of it, it should go to this. And you have two occurrences of it. One is in the CSS code, but simply hit enter again, and then you get the element in the context of the skin. And so here it is, the Pano_title field on the upper right corner. And it is very easy to identify elements or to search elements if they have a CSS class attached. It's a very powerful structural use case besides any styling jobs CSS has, and it's very useful. And I'm usually marking important elements in my skins with classes, even if I don't use them for any styling. In the last short section of this tutorial, I want to point out some helpful pages for everyone who wants to dive into JavaScript and who needs help to figure out what all this programming stuff is doing. And let's head over to a little collection with 3 points I have collected for you. First of all is the JavaScript API documentation of Pano2VR itself. I already showed it to you. And if you go to the index, you have the reference, and then you have a JavaScript API. If you head over the documentation, just fold out the reference menu folder here, and you will find the JavaScript API. The great advantage is, as it is a single page, as I showed before, if you hit Command F and you check for a variable, you find all these vocabularies, and you can search for anything you want to know or what is popping up in the browser console if you are exploring the object trees. And this reference is the first stop you need to get a little bit familiar with the JavaScript API of Pano2VR. A second very helpful resource when it comes to learning of JavaScript, you can get to one of the countless web resources, and the MDN This stands for Mozilla Developer Network. Mozilla is the creator of Firefox, and they are responsible for a large part of developing the web as we know it now. And this is a very nice learning resource, and very systematically when it comes to learning CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, and you have references for all the languages and all the basic web technologies the internet relies on. And when it comes to JavaScript, you have a really complete guide and reference of all elements and functions and events and whatever you search for. And this is a very good and systematic resource, and it's kind of the basic reference of the web itself when it comes to technologies. As all references, the Mozilla Developer Network has one disadvantage. Everything is in there, but you need where to look at, and at least you need about the right terms to search for. And if you just have a question regarding JavaScript, then I recommend to head over to Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is the best resource if you have any questions about a technology. And Stack Overflow is an open forum. It is huge, really huge, and you can ask a lot of questions about web stuff of any kind. And if you type your problem in Google, the chance that the first hits lead to Stack Overflow are very, very high. And it is an indispensable helper when it comes to web technologies, and especially the JavaScript section is really huge. And here you see collected a lot of experience and a lot of helpful tips and tricks, and even if something is buggy, the audience of Stack Overflow gets a notice on this and tries to find workarounds and so on. It is extremely helpful.